All right, we're here with Ian Golden. Ian, we were just saying, we sat down about a year ago in your shop downtown in Ithaca here to talk about your congressional run. Just basically, what have you seen? Give us your general overview of what you've seen across the district in this last year running for Congress here.
It's been a blur. As you know, it's a big congressional district. You've covered it as well. Area the size of New Jersey. I think there are some common underlying themes. I think some of our local economies harder pressed than others. A lot of concern over health care more recently, and actually even a year ago. I think some concerns for instance, some older communities concerned about cuts to Medicare, Social Security. I think that was deepened in some of those concerns with the tax bill that was passed in the interim. The budget resolution that I think was just approved in the committee just this week also I think rekindles those fears. A lot of people are having hard times despite the rosy economic figures that I think that were presented. And people are pretty engaged. I think they're largely ready for change. I think largely feel that there's not enough, I think, being done at a legislative level, that the process is corrupted and fairly dysfunctional. And not that that's new, but I think that the increased divisiveness in the communities is really, I think, bringing it to a polarizing head.
Mm-hmm. And you named a lot of different things in that sphere, but what to you right now is the most important national level issue that affects constituents in the district here?
I think they're really interrelated. So I think yesterday Representative Reed introduced, I think, a press release on myself, Max, and Tracy. For me, he introduced the concept of me being a flipping back and forth on top priorities. And I think the reality is that there are a lot of top priorities. I mean, if you're to say what's the singular largest issue, well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess really the largest singular issue is the, I feel like, dysfunction of the process. I think it's really removed from being really about the people. I think both parties are more towing or beholden to special interests and big money lines. I think there's a lot of voter disenfranchisement, whether from voting rights or partisan gerrymandering, as an example. But I think the reality is that the largest issue that I think that most people are, and so I feel like if we can't address that, then it's tough to get to some of the other any of the other issues we really want to get to. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to what's maybe a largest or the top issue for, I think, 45% of families across the district is really having a hard time making ends meet. Mm-hmm. If I think long term to the future of my daughters, where things are headed, I believe that we're at this point past environmental tipping points. And so, if you ask to really pin down to one issue, I think that they really all tie together. And so I think I can speak a lot about top issues, but I don't know if there's a singular top issue.
So if you end up in Congress, a long way down the road here, mm-hmm. if you end up in Congress as a freshman, you will be put on a committee. Mm-hmm. What to you would be your top congressional committee that you think, if you have to prioritize your work in Congress into one committee, one issue area, where do you think you see yourself?
Well, I think, to my understanding, it won't necessarily be up to me. Mm-hmm. I think prior Representative Massa went in there, and I think was a little bit more hard-headed on, I think, choosing his, but I believe it's not necessarily up to me. And when I look at a lot of bills and resolutions that are introduced into the House, even this past year, I think representatives are pretty, I think, successful in wherever they're put, crafting bills that apply to top concerns area of their district. In terms of some of the specifics, transportation and infrastructure for sure would be a focus as a committee. If we talk about, I think, some of the things that are across the district, crisscrossing through, I see the crumbling bridges, I see the crumbling roads. My daughters here in Ithaca can't drink from their school's water supply based on lead or metal content. The internet, wastewater, there's so many things that are really have fallen behind or only getting more expensive. And if we talk about opportunities for needed job growth and community growth, I think that would be one area. Mm-hmm. If I end up on the Ag Committee, well, our farmers are having a really hard time. Mm-hmm. Some sectors harder than others at this point. Dairy farmers, from my understanding, maybe more than 100 dairy farms lost since the beginning of this year. And I don't believe that our current representative is really doing much there. Again, wherever I get placed in terms of committee, I'm going to make the best of it, and then we'll go from there and see what I can work up and into.
Mm-hmm. On transportation, the running joke around Washington is, hey, it's infrastructure week. It's infrastructure week, and we haven't had infrastructure week yet. Do you mm-hmm. think if you would end up in the House, or whomever may end up in the House, we could get some bipartisan agreement going? And exactly how would you foster that conversation with some of your colleagues? Keep in mind, you would be a freshman in Congress.
Yeah. And so from my vantage point, I feel like if either, I get it. There's so many more glossier issues than maybe infrastructure. That there ends up being these galvanizing wedge issues that take priority, that consume the politic down there. But I also feel like if either party were really, intent on wanting to save us money long term, make wise investments, create jobs, occupational opportunities, then it would be really figure something out in infrastructure. Even Representative Reed's bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus, which I think most of us are unclear on what, if any, problems they've solved to date. Well, I think that they came out with an infrastructure blueprint months ago, and it's decent. It seems like literally a bipartisan possibility. Yet for all of the opportunity, I've heard nothing out of Representative Reed to talk about it, to pitch it, to support it. Mm-hmm. And so there would be an example. And so, to your point, me as a freshman, I'm going to have to do what I can to see who's already invested in what areas. From my understanding, there's so many, bills or resolutions that are put forth that representatives or legislators never really intend to go places. It's almost putting it forth just so they can maybe get some headlines for it, to show their constituents they did something, but where's the front end action on the back to really build the coalition ahead of time to, rather than putting it into 5 different bills that are introduced, let's say, can we come together even on our own and introduce one that more of us can get behind, and then will we have the control of the House or counterparts to the Senate where some of these bills are able to be brought to the floor. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of the issue as well. Some of these just never see the light of day.
I want to dig into that, but I want to go back to agriculture policy as well. But leadership is a big discussion going on around, especially the Democratic Party. If you would end up back in the House, would you cast a vote for Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House?
No, and I've been asked this several times, and I respect and thank Representative Pelosi for what she's done for her party, but I believe that it's time for new energy and change. I believe at this point she's very much used as a galvanizing figure to galvanize, I think, the conservative base. Painted as added touch, and whether that's true or not, I think that it's going on, and I think that, again, it's time for, new energy in the party.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the leadership is kind of responsible for holding up a lot of those bills, things that don't come to the floor, that might have bipartisan agreement that don't make it to the floor?
I can't really say from the outside at this point. I don't know all of the inner workings, how they're communicating, what's intentional, what's just part of the mired in the entire process. I can't say. Mm-hmm.
Now I want to talk back to ag policy. I know I've seen a lot of press releases, a lot of photos with you meeting with dairy farmers across the district. Could you dig into that a little bit? What have dairy farmers been telling you, and what kind of insight would you bring to Congress about policies that might work to help the struggling dairy farmers in the district?
Yeah. So there was, I think maybe a couple months ago at this point, I was meeting with a dairy farmer in Steuben County. I think he's voted for Representative Reed the past 4 times. I believe independent. I think pretty vocal in the community. One of the, examples of a farmer that's just at the end of the rope on the dairy end. So many of them struggling. Suicide rates multiple times higher than even returning veterans. The increased consolidation of our smaller farms going away and rolling into just these large, in effect, monopoly co-ops or entities, but having a really hard time. As I mentioned, potentially over 100 this year gone, and they need to find more of the stat on that, but really struggling. And so when this individual reached out to some of his community to put together a meeting to try to get other farmers to meet with me, it was, I think, in an evening. Otherwise, has had a really hard time, I think, getting a response or any contact from our current representative or his office historically. Well, just putting that out to, I think, in an email to 40 other farmers, Representative Reed's, I think, right-hand person was on the phone with him the following morning, basically trying to head off the process, encouraging others.
You guys meeting.
Yeah, encouraging and others not to meet with me or attend that meeting. Which, if that's what it takes to get Representative Reed's ear on the topic, then all right, well, I'm glad I played a part there. But the response was that, in effect, Representative Reed wasn't aware that there was a big crisis going on with dairy farms. And I think it speaks to the nature of where we're at in terms of the thought process of there's no business that's too, I think, big to be curtailed or whatever that may bring. And so what I'm seeing is the loss of hundreds of small businesses all rolling into massive entities that are basically gutting our communities, losing community identities, business opportunities, futures. And it's rolled into certain areas with just these mega businesses, whether it be farms or outside of the other industry. And so if you're looking at the vantage point of how much, for instance, dairy we're producing, well, if you're under the assumption that we're okay if it all gets rolled up into one or two large farms, then all right, then maybe to your point, there's no problem with dairy. But from my vantage point, when we're losing our small businesses, our small farmers, when those individuals are, as I mentioned, committing suicide to higher rates than even veterans, from my vantage point, and really working or fighting for the little guy, or then there's a big problem from my vantage point.
So what do you do about it?
Yeah, so one of Representative Reed's responses was, well, they should maybe just find something else to do, or they should invest in the MPP, the Milk Price Protection Program, basically an insurance policy for farmers.
Or was that what his office emailed to them?
It was conveyed in the meeting or communications with that individual. Mm-hmm. They also, I think, had might have been a radio interview meeting that week with other reporters, and I can't remember whether that was a specific that was put out there. So it would have to be verified in whatever form. But what we can look at is a fairly situation that's got different roots. So part of it is just oversupply at this point. We've got price levels that farmers are able to achieve a certain needed revenue from the product that have been set at a certain level, which are at this point below cost values, and for 4 years. So we're at a price level cost crisis. Basically, we've got an oversupply where now, instead of quality or other measures, they're having to meet from their financial obligations, from banks, from loans, for whatever, they're having to produce more and more based on having thinner margins, which is exacerbating the oversupply. You've got the European market, which took off its quota system, I think, in 2014 or 15 or somewhere in there, which exacerbated a world oversupply. You've got less consumption based on more people turning to alternatives like almond or soy, potentially more allergies to dairy products. And so you really have a crux area that we're at. You've got something like the Milk Price Protection Program, as Representative Reed referred to. Well, you have Senator Gillibrand that introduced a couple pieces of legislation, one of which dealt with the MPP this past year. So there's already balls in motion. And what she was saying was, for all the money that the MPP program is taking in, that it probably at this point shouldn't just be returned to the Treasury, but it should be returned to the small farmers or farmers at all that are paying into it. They're the ones that really need the help, and that's whose money it is.
So you would suggest more of a subsidy-type program. Gillibrand's isn't exactly a subsidy.
It's not just subsidies, and I think that a lot of farmers just getting more subsidies isn't the way out. I don't think just throwing more money at it, more subsidies, isn't necessarily the way to go. We could look at a quota program like Canada uses. There's a lot of particularly larger entities and industrial farms that would have nothing of the quota. The lobbyists in Congress on behalf of those special interests, that special set of the dairy industry, would probably want nothing to do with the quota. But what you see is it working very effectively in Canada to allow the small farmers to make at least decent livings. And you've seen it work in other nations. And so would that be one possibility? It would be a possibility, and I'd want to talk more to farmers at large to see if you could develop a coalition around that. Again, one of her other pieces around the MPP program, well, there's a potential fix to the MPP is not just having more people buy into insurance, but all right, so what do you do with that funding at the end? If it's not used, then return it to the farmers, because they're the ones who really need it. We can look at antitrust or anti-monopoly entities. So you have, I think, a situation right now as an example where Walmart, being a massive retailer, I believe that they're consolidating all of their milk supply into 3 of their own farms at this point and doing away with supply coming from these other entities. So now you're going to have the entire Walmart chain that is supplied by 3 Walmart-owned farms, I believe, and processors. And so just the impact that that has on networks around the nation, and let alone communities that are feeding into it as it is now, I think that there's something that could be done there as well.
Now, looking at the primary on Tuesday and back into the general, those dairy farmers, maybe not so much in the primary, but in a general election sense, what is the kind of sense you are getting from them electorally? Do you think a lot of them, which sit in mainly conservative areas, would cross the aisle to support you if you were bringing these kind of ideas?
This individual was just one. I think another candidate, Tracy Matrano, has had some pretty good, I think, connections with dairy farmers as well. And from some of those have been Republicans or independents. So, I think that our pool that we're able to connect with right now isn't huge, and so I can't speak for large enough numbers. And from my vantage point, I'm not out there assessing voter pools. Like, I'm not reaching out to the dairy sector just to try to pull more votes. I'm really looking for and trying to find legitimate problems that are really hurting our district and our families and our communities. And I'm trying to find solutions to help those communities. And if it translates to votes, then great. But I'm not going out there with an eye for what that voter block looks like.
Now I want to touch on tax policy. This is a big thing that's being championed by Congressman Reed with last year's tax code overhaul, and that he's championing a lot as a win. Your brief take on the changes to the tax code, and if you would end up in Congress looking forward, what do you think are going to be the effects of that you might have to deal with as a congressman?
Yeah, I think that they were very, effective in tailoring and pitching and selling this tax plan. I think for most of us in upstate New York, the reality is that our tax load's really high. My parents moved up here about a year ago, and they were really weighing whether they could do it at all based on the tax hit that they were going to take in just moving up from Pennsylvania. Do New Yorkers need tax relief? They do.
Do you think that needs to come at the state level,
though? I think it could come at potentially both levels. I think the reality is that it's coming out of the pockets ends up being from whether it be municipal, state, from federal level. I think the reality is that people see it as just one bulk package of taxes are high. And I think that really what needs to happen is there needs to be coordination between the federal and the state levels and down to the municipal to see how it's impacting state to make sure that we're getting a plan that really connects. You can't just pull away certain levels of federal funding and not have it impact state taxes. You can't pull away a certain level of state funding and not have it impact the taxes at a local level or real estate. But to your larger point of the tax plan, and I feel that they were intentional on appealing to that issue, which is a very real issue. But I think that they almost, spun it to get it through. And so I think that they gave, individuals a certain figure, whether it was $1,200 or $1,500 at the time that the average household was going to recoup. And I think from what we're seeing, the reality is that it's far, far less than that. and then the fear, and then if we talk about then where even the benefits going from the tax brackets and policies. So if we're looking at the vast majority of the gain going to the wealthiest among us, or the corporations. Well, the wealthiest among us and the corporations at this point aren't the ones that need it most. And further, they're not the ones that spend into and where we get the greatest gain for putting more money back in the pockets of individuals. So if we look at whatever the figure is, 80% of the gain going to the top 1%, 65% of the gain going to the top 0.3% of earners. I mean, I get the conservative take that those individuals are already bearing in actual dollars more of the brunt. That for many of them the feel is, well, if they've earned it, they should keep it in that regard. I think the reality is that it ends up getting sent down the chain where the brunt's borne more by the middle class or the poorer classes, and I just don't think the system's designed to work that way. If you look, go ahead.
Yeah. Do you think the tax cuts the program passed the last year? Do you think that has had a positive impact, at least in the last few months, on constituents in the district, though?
I think there has been some gain there, yeah, and I think from the beginning I've also tried to highlight where some of the benefits have been. So I think I still have a note on our Facebook page that I think it's tagged to the top, because I think it's just in a note format, where I was really trying to look at the tax plan objectively. I think through the time where last year where that was really hot as a topic, I was also getting fed information from DC and from the party and saying, here are the points that we really want you to focus on. Here's what you should put out in op-eds. And from my vantage point, it was still divisive. It was biased. It wasn't acknowledging the whole situation. And what I was saying was, so if you look at, for instance, some of those, the amount of individuals in our district who itemize, for instance, I think is around 20 or 23%. So if we were looking, when we were looking at the deduction framework of the tax plan, the idea to just double the standard deduction and put a cap on itemized deductions, well, the reality was that that would probably help more people in our district, where 78% don't itemize their taxes. So giving them the standard deduction, it would probably help them more. Mm-hmm. So I think that there was some gain. But what I'm also looking at is for all of the intent, for Representative Reed to say he's been working on this for 7 years, having a certain amount of meetings around it. If I'm looking at tax plan and what I feel will boost the economy, provide substance to families, I think it was a spin tactic to say this is the best that we could do. Was there some gain, to your point? Yeah, there's some gain. Mm-hmm. But now if it comes at the expense of now justifying a budget where I think in just this budget resolution that was approved literally this week, saying I think it was 1.5 trillion in cuts to, maybe it was Medicare, and maybe it was $716 billion or something like that to Medicaid. And I only just looked at it right before I came in, so those figures wouldn't be accurate. But some massive cuts to those entitlement programs. Well, now we're looking at programs that attribute to individuals being able to spend back into our economy. And unless you're creating more opportunities to fill those gaps, to alleviate those entitlement programs, then I don't believe you're fixing anything. You're in effect now raising taxes on communities on the back end. Now, real estate taxes, property taxes are going to now have to counterbalance it and go up. So I think that was there some gain? Yes, but I don't believe that it's as much as we could have gotten, and I don't believe it's going into the pockets of those who really need the cuts.
Mm-hmm. I want to touch on another few areas quick on that topic, healthcare, mm-hmm. Medicaid, Medicare, very big issue, but over the campaign, has your view changed at all on that topic? And if so, what are a few steps you would take to either preserve the Obamacare as it exists now, or change it, add to it, real quick?
Yeah, I don't know how much, I think, longer the Affordable Care Act is going to survive. I think they're successively, gutting some critical pieces of it that are making it unstable. I think the projection in New York is that our health insurance rates are going to go up maybe 24% this next year. And so I don't know what's going to happen with the Affordable
So
Care
what are
Act.
some of one of the more important aspects of the ACA that you would fight hardest to preserve?
I think it's tough. I think they designed it as a package where it really needs to exist as a package deal. Otherwise, I don't think that it works. From my vantage point, where I think the Republicans were, and in concert with the private health insurance industry, was looking to go, and the amount of people that would be either thrown off or seeing unsustainable rates of health insurance premiums would be those with considered pre-existing conditions. Mm-hmm. And where they're taking that was literally, I shouldn't say literally, but it seemed like the vast majority of females at large would be considered having some level of pre-existing conditions. Without, I think, revenues or real wages going up on households or workers across the district, we can't sustain health care or health insurance rather rates, premiums that keep going up and up and up. So one of the critical components or features of the Affordable Care Act was that pre-existing condition market, where it was allowing everybody to come in under a market, and that required a certain level of everybody buying in or a certain level of subsidies. For my family, that did hit us. My wife, one of my daughters, would probably be considered having pre-existing conditions. Medication that is required in the mix would be difficult to afford on our own. So if we lost health insurance, it would be very difficult to get by. And so I think that that's the story for a lot of families. Now, I don't think the Affordable Care Act is also a stopping point. I think it ended up being a handout to the very lucrative health insurance industry. I think that it doesn't make as much economic sense, the model that we're operating under. I've been a long proponent of single-payer systems. I've lobbied in Albany for the New York Health Act. 2 of my small businesses are sponsors of it. And I'll continue to do all I can to say I'll work for Medicare for all at a federal level.
But do you really think it's possible on a federal level at this point?
Whether it would pass next year? No, probably not. But when you're looking at the turning of the tide of the national sentiment toward it, where 60-70% of people, depending on how you phrase the question on the poll, would approve of a single-payer system, I think we're going in that direction.
Mm-hmm. I want to cut
Sure.
you off. We got to get
Yeah.
some more topics in.
Yeah.
Real quick, immigration is
Mm-hmm.
the hot topic of the day. We're seeing more and more pictures, images come out from the border where family separation this last week was the major issue. But looking at this from a broader sense, across the district, what do you think the most important aspect of the immigration issue? We have a lot of aspects to it, DACA, worker programs, etc. What do you think is the most important localized impact of the immigration debate as it happens now, and how would you prioritize that in Congress?
On the local level, what I hear most often, aside from the morality issue, who we are as a nation, whether what they're doing right now is just, whether that's who we are. People don't want to see families torn apart. I mean, I get where people are coming from, and they want to establish a precedent that these individuals or families are maybe coming across illegally, that this sets a precedent to go with the zero tolerance. I get that a certain portion of the base wants to see that. But I think that with a larger sense, I think when it comes down to it, most people also don't believe that this is who we are as a nation. With that overarching feel, what I hear most across the district is that this is an issue of that hits our employers, whether it be dairy farms, whether it be vineyards. They would be two that represent a large business entity, I guess, across our district. And so I think one of the first meetings that I had over a year ago at this point was with a vineyard owner, and their top concern was the need for comprehensive immigration reform and a guest worker program. Without, I think, both of those things, it's increasingly difficult for us to find the bodies, individuals, skilled labor that we need to really make these entities work. And
I got to cut you off. I'm sorry.
That's right.
Real quick, Second Amendment. You came out with an interesting stance. You would support repealing the SAFE Act, the New York SAFE Act. Of course, that's not on the national level, but because gun owners weren't at the table. Could you briefly explain that quick? And where are you at with this ever-changing situation on firearms? Yeah,
and I think that's still the case. I see the SAFE Act as I continue to go across the district, and I may have said it a year ago and I still say it. I still see more Repeal the SAFE Act signs than I do stop signs in some of our communities. It's a very, I think, passionate issue across our district. And so what I see the SAFE Act is it was a fairly knee-jerk piece of legislation that was passed overnight in response to Sandy Hook, passed by a Republican-controlled legislature in Albany that didn't have the time or I think consideration for the legal responsible gun owners at the table. So would there have been aspects to it that were effective or needed or beneficial? Maybe. But I think that what we need to do is I think if we're really going to get somewhere in a fairly, not just fairly, a very divided and heated topic, then it really needs to be something that's crafted with legal responsible gun owners at the table. I think many of them felt like they were being, I think, treated as criminals, and whether it was really contributing to keeping, I think, guns out of the hands of those who they shouldn't have been in the hands of, debatable. So to your point, yes, I would still be in favor of repealing the SAFE Act, because what I'd want to see is I'd want to see those legal responsible gun owners at the table saying, come to the table, let's craft a policy that really makes sense on all levels, let's find some sort of meeting in the middle ground, and let's do something about it.
I got to cut you off there. I'm sorry, we're at a time limit. Last question, though. If you would lose the Democratic primary on Tuesday, would you throw your support behind any of the candidates on the Democratic side that would secure the nomination?
Yeah, I think that there are certain candidates that the reality is that I would be more, I think, excited about than others, that I would work harder for, that I would feel better about them bringing, I think, the needed change, honesty, transparency, I think, to office. Would any of them get my vote? Would I make some calls? Would I knock on some doors? I would, because I feel like what we have now in terms of representation, I just don't feel like there's enough being done for our district, and I think it's time for change and new energy. And so I will support whichever candidate emerges on Tuesday. Okay.
All right, that's it. Thank you so much again for sitting down.
Yeah, for sure.
And you can get back out there on the campaign trail.
Cool. Thanks, Vaughn.